The glass walls of the conference room gleamed with the morning light, reflecting the city skyline beyond. Devon Global had always been a place of quiet order, where processes mattered and results spoke louder than personalities. I had worked here for nearly 7 years, building a reputation as someone who valued precision over flair, substance over show. My projects were never flashy, but they worked flawlessly, and everyone knew it. That balance shifted the day Daniel Mercer walked in. He was the company's newly hired senior manager, a man in his late 30s with slicked back hair, an expensive suit, and a voice that carried too easily across the room. From the first handshake, I sensed what others missed. Daniel was a performer, not a builder. He had the kind of charisma that could sell an idea without ever truly understanding it. His jokes drew quick laughter. His confidence commanded attention, and his ability to improvise made him seem sharper than he really was. The executives loved him immediately, and his charm quickly began weaving its way into the culture of the office. But I noticed the details others overlooked. The way he glanced at other people's screens during walkthroughs. The way his questions were never about why we built something, only how fast it could be replicated. Most of all, I noticed his sudden fascination with my project. Aurora, a proprietary system I had spent 2 years perfecting. Aurora wasn't just another software tool. It was the backbone of our data integration strategy, a complex architecture that allowed the company to streamline compliance checks across multiple regions. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved millions in regulatory fines and man-hours. Executives didn't always understand it, but they trusted it because it never failed, and because it had my fingerprints on every line of its design. Daniel began circling Aurora almost immediately. At first, he framed his curiosity as admiration. "This is brilliant work," he told me one afternoon, leaning casually against my desk. "I'd love to understand it better. Maybe so I can help pitch it to senior leadership." His tone was smooth, but something in the way his eyes flickered across my notes told me this wasn't about learning. It was about taking. Over the next weeks, his pattern grew clearer. He requested walkthroughs, asked for clarification notes, and sat silently in meetings where Aurora was discussed, his eyes narrowing as if memorizing every bullet point on the slides. Once I even caught him photographing a whiteboard after hours, something he brushed off as just trying to catch up. I kept my calm. Years of experience had taught me that people like Daniel always overplayed their hand. The trick was patience, observing, documenting, and letting them trap themselves. By the second month, whispers began to spread. Daniel had become the go-to guy for leadership updates, the one executives invited for quick coffee chats to brainstorm strategies. He had charm, no doubt, and he wielded it ruthlessly. I overheard him once in the cafeteria, casually dropping lines like, "Aurora? Oh yes, I've been deeply involved in optimizing that system." Deeply involved? He hadn't written a single line of code, hadn't handled a single compliance query. Still, the people he spoke to nodded, impressed by his confidence. The more he inserted himself into my work, the more deliberate I became. I stopped correcting him in public. When he misrepresented a technical term, I simply nodded and scribbled a note. When he claimed credit for a minor feature, I let it slide, because every interaction was teaching me something important. He wasn't careful. He was so sure of his charm and position that he left traces of his lies everywhere he went. The real test came during the quarterly review. The conference hall was packed. Department heads, board observers, and even 2 overseas directors joining via video call. I sat at my usual spot, second row, laptop open, ready to present updates on Aurora's integration metrics. But when the agenda rolled over to data integration and compliance systems, it wasn't my name the moderator called. It was Daniel's. He strode to the podium with that trademark smile, adjusting his tie as though he had owned the stage all his life. My slide deck, my carefully prepared slides, flashed onto the screen behind him. For a heartbeat, I thought there had been some mistake. Then he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing here is the result of months of strategic effort. Our team, under my direction, has redefined how Devon Global handles compliance data." My stomach clenched. He wasn't just taking credit. He was rewriting history, line by line, graph by graph. He presented Aurora as though it were his brainchild. He even stumbled slightly when explaining a technical feature, but quickly smoothed over the gap with corporate buzzwords that made the audience nod along. Around me, I sensed colleagues stealing glances in my direction. Some looked confused, others sympathetic. A few executives scribbled notes, their faces alight with admiration. And me, I didn't move. Not a twitch, not a word. I let him finish. Let the applause wash over him as he returned to his seat, radiating triumph. He leaned back, catching my eye across the table, and offered the faintest smirk, like a man who believed the game was already won. Inside, I felt something sharper than anger. Resolve. He had just crossed the invisible line from opportunist to thief. And thieves, no matter how clever, always leave traces behind. That evening, when the office had emptied and the city lights flickered on across the skyline, I sat at my desk and opened Aurora's back end. Quietly, almost invisibly, I began compiling the digital fingerprints embedded deep within the system. Metadata, log entries, design signatures. Proof that would speak louder than any presentation, no matter how charmingly delivered. My eyes traced through the logs, each line reaffirming what I already knew. Aurora was mine, down to the smallest detail. The next morning, Daniel walked past my desk with a swagger, tossing a casual, "Great meeting yesterday, huh?" I smiled politely, closing the folder on my laptop. "Yes," I replied. "Very enlightening." He grinned, mistaking my calm for surrender, and strutted off toward another executive's office. That was when I knew the trap was already setting itself. He believed he had silenced me. He believed he had rewritten the story. But I was still here, and the story was far from finished. Daniel Mercer thought he had stolen my project. What he didn't know was that Aurora had been designed with a hidden truth. Every single detail was tied to me. And when the time came, that truth would be the blade that cut down his carefully built facade. Daniel Mercer thought he had stolen my project. What he didn't know was that Aurora had been designed with a hidden truth. Every single detail was tied to me. And when the time came, that truth would be the blade that cut down his carefully built facade. In the days following the quarterly review, Daniel's confidence swelled. He walked the hallways with the air of someone who had already secured his promotion. Executives paused to congratulate him, junior staff rushed to impress him, and even the CEO mentioned his brilliant leadership during an all-hands meeting. I watched it unfold with a quiet detachment, noting how quickly people gravitated to charisma when it was wrapped in the right packaging. But I also noticed something else. Daniel had started treating me differently. Where once he had faked respect, now he exuded a thinly veiled arrogance. He began excluding me from certain meetings, conveniently forgetting to forward calendar invites. He assigned my tasks to others, presenting it as if I were too busy with minor responsibilities. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a natural shift of priorities, but I knew better. This was his way of erasing me from my own creation. One afternoon, he cornered me in the break room, a smug smile tugging at his lips. "You know, you really should lighten up," he said casually, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You do great technical work, but leadership is about visibility. People don't remember who coded the system. They remember who sold it. That's what I do best. Presentation, strategy. You should thank me, really. I'm making Aurora bigger than it ever could have been under your radar." I met his gaze, my expression unreadable. "Bigger doesn't always mean better," I replied softly. His smirk faltered for half a second, then returned even wider, as if my words amused him. He walked away with the arrogance of a man convinced he was untouchable. That night, I stayed late at the office. The building was quiet, just the hum of servers and the occasional flicker of cleaning staff passing by. On my screen, lines of code stretched endlessly, each embedded with markers only I understood, unique IDs, encryption keys, subtle design quirks that no outsider could ever fake. Aurora wasn't just software. It was a map of my mind. Anyone who tried to claim it would eventually stumble into contradictions they couldn't explain. As I compiled more records, emails, version histories, encrypted logs, I felt a calmness settle over me. This wasn't anger driving me anymore. It was clarity. Daniel was building his empire on stolen bricks. and I was patiently recording every crack forming in the walls. The turning point came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, Daniel called an emergency team meeting. He strutted into the room, eyes gleaming with excitement, and announced, "We've been selected to showcase Aurora at the upcoming Global Strategy Summit in Geneva. This is a massive opportunity for Devon Global, and for me, personally." He let the last words linger, as though daring anyone to question them. Around the table, murmurs of approval rose. The summit was prestigious, attended by international regulators and industry leaders. Presenting there was considered a career-defining achievement. Daniel basked in the admiration, then began assigning roles. He claimed the keynote presentation for himself, of course, and handed off minor tasks to others. When he reached me, he paused, almost smirking. "You'll be handling background support," he said. "Documentation, technical queries, that sort of thing. Important work, but not really the spotlight. You understand." I simply nodded. My silence seemed to embolden him further, as though he believed I had accepted my diminished role. In truth, I was already thinking several steps ahead. Geneva would be the perfect stage, not for his rise, but for his fall. Over the next days, I doubled my efforts. While Daniel rehearsed flashy speeches and polished his slides, I worked quietly, embedding undeniable evidence into Aurora's demo environment. Every report generated carried encrypted timestamps linked to my credentials. Every system log revealed my digital signature. It was subtle enough that Daniel wouldn't notice, but clear enough that any auditor, or curious executive, would. Meanwhile, his overconfidence began creating small but noticeable cracks. In one rehearsal, he mispronounced a core function of Aurora, brushing off the error with a joke. In another, he promised features that didn't exist, leaving the technical team scrambling to patch together explanations. Colleagues whispered doubts in private, though none dared confront him directly. On the eve of the summit, I found myself alone in the office once again. I stood by the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white. My reflection stared back at me, calm and resolute. Tomorrow, the world would see Aurora, but they would also see the truth behind it. And Daniel Mercer's carefully crafted image would shatter under the weight of his own lies. When our flight landed in Geneva, the team was buzzing with excitement. The hotel lobby overflowed with executives, analysts, and journalists. Daniel thrived in the environment, shaking hands, laughing loudly, promising stories of innovation. He introduced himself as the architect of Aurora, and I watched as people scribbled his name into their notebooks. But I didn't correct him. Not yet. The next morning, the summit hall filled with hundreds of attendees. Giant screens projected the Devon Global logo, and the hum of anticipation filled the air. When Daniel walked on stage, the applause was immediate. He launched into his speech with practiced charm, painting himself as the visionary behind Aurora. He spoke of sleepless nights, breakthrough moments, bold decisions, all things he had never experienced. Then came the live demo. Daniel clicked through the interface confidently, explaining features with broad strokes of exaggeration, but the system logs, projected in real time on the side screens, told a different story. Each entry, each operation, carried identifiers, my identifiers. At first, the audience didn't notice. Then a few began murmuring, pointing at the bottom corner of the display where my encrypted signature appeared again and again. Daniel faltered. He tried to scroll past it quickly, but the log entries were unavoidable. My name, my digital code, my proof, it was everywhere. The executives on the front row leaned forward, whispering to each other, their expressions shifting from admiration to confusion. For the first time since he had joined Devon Global, Daniel Mercer looked rattled. His voice cracked slightly as he rushed through the final slides, sweat beading at his temples. The applause at the end was polite, but subdued, nothing like the triumphant roar he had expected. As we walked off stage, he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed under his breath. I met his eyes calmly. "Nothing," I said. "Aurora just tells the truth." Daniel's grip on my arm lingered for a moment longer, his eyes darting around to make sure no one else heard his whisper. The smooth confidence that had always wrapped around him like an expensive suit was gone. In its place was something raw, panic. I simply pulled my arm free and kept walking, my steps steady as though nothing unusual had happened. But inside, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The cracks in his facade were no longer invisible. Now, the entire room had seen them. Back at the hotel, the atmosphere among the team was tense. A few colleagues tried to offer polite congratulations on a good presentation, but their voices lacked conviction. One of the senior directors, Mr. Caldwell, approached me directly. He was an older man, known for his sharp eye and blunt words. "Strange presentation today," he said, peering at me over his glasses. "Those system logs, they all pointed to you. Care to explain?" I gave a small, measured smile. "Aurora was my design, sir."
"Every build, every update, every audit trail connects back to my credentials."
"The system doesn't lie." Caldwell studied me for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod, as though piecing together a puzzle he had long suspected. "I thought as much," he muttered, before walking away without another word. But the weight of his acknowledgement settled firmly in my chest. The truth had found its first audience. Daniel, however, wasn't ready to surrender. The following day, he avoided me entirely, throwing himself into damage control. He told anyone who would listen that the identifiers in the logs were legacy artifacts, relics from when Aurora had been a smaller prototype. He claimed he had simply scaled and perfected the system into what it was today. Some people nodded, willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But others exchanged skeptical glances. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing faster than he realized. When we returned from Geneva, the office felt different. Whispers traveled faster than emails. People who once admired Daniel now watched him with wary eyes, while others quietly sought me out to ask cautious questions about Aurora's origins. I answered simply, never embellishing, never accusing, just facts. It was enough. Truth, after all, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard. But Daniel wasn't finished. A cornered man is often the most dangerous. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I found him waiting near the elevator. His smile was tight, forced, and his voice carried an edge. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said quietly. "Dropping your little signatures into the system, making me look like a fool in front of the board. But here's the thing, you don't win in this game by being right. You win by being seen. And I've already been seen." I met his gaze, unflinching. Being seen doesn't matter if people stop believing what they see. For the first time, his smirk faltered without recovery. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Careful," he hissed. "You have no idea how ugly things can get if I decide you're in my way." I didn't respond. I simply stepped into the elevator, pressing the button, letting the doors close between us like a silent declaration of war. From that day, Daniel's tactics grew more desperate. He began subtly altering reports, removing my name from documentation, and rewriting internal memos to cast himself as Aurora's sole architect. In meetings, he twisted facts, portraying me as a technical assistant rather than a creator. At first, these lies found traction. After all, people often prefer the story that flatters the speaker. But his arrogance betrayed him. In one critical meeting with compliance regulators, Daniel promised features Aurora could not deliver. When the regulators pressed for proof, he stumbled, turning to me with pleading eyes. I calmly provided the actual data, correcting his exaggerations. The regulators thanked me directly, barely acknowledging him. It was a small moment, but in corporate environments, small moments are where reputations shift. Behind the scenes, I continued gathering proof. Every false memo he wrote, I archived. Every altered report, I saved in its original form. Every discrepancy, I documented meticulously. I wasn't just waiting for him to fall anymore. I was building the foundation of the collapse. And then the collapse began. 2 months after Geneva, the board called an unscheduled review meeting. Whispers suggested they had been comparing Daniel's claims with system performance reports. The numbers didn't align. Promised features weren't appearing. Deadlines had been missed under his watch. And through it all, Aurora's logs remained consistent, pointing back to me. The meeting room was tense, executives sitting in polished silence as Daniel delivered yet another rehearsed pitch. He spoke of strategic growth and visionary leadership, but his voice no longer carried the same easy confidence. It wavered, cracked at the edges. When questions began, sharp, pointed questions, his mask slipped further. "Mr. Mercer," one board member asked, "can you explain why every audit trail in Aurora identifies someone else as the creator?" Daniel hesitated, then launched into his usual excuse about legacy code. But this time, the board didn't look convinced. Finally, Caldwell spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Enough! We've reviewed the evidence. The truth is clear. Aurora was not your work, Mercer. It was hers." The room turned to me. For the first time, all eyes were not on Daniel, but on me. And in that silence, I felt the weight of months of patience crystallize into vindication. Daniel's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The board members exchanged glances, their decision already made. What followed was swift and merciless. He was stripped of his authority, his responsibilities reassigned, and his leadership publicly corrected. The empire of lies he had built, brick by stolen brick, had finally crumbled. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel sat slumped in his chair, staring at nothing. For a man who had thrived on attention, the silence around him was louder than any condemnation. He had been seen, yes, but now everyone saw him for what he truly was. And I walked out of that room with my head held high, not because I had one, but because the truth had. Daniel Mercer was finished in the eyes of the board, but men like him rarely accept defeat gracefully. In the days that followed his demotion, he clung desperately to whatever scraps of authority he still had left. He stalked through the halls of Devon Global like a ghost of his former self, once admired, now avoided. Colleagues who once rushed to greet him now turned away, whispering in corners. His phone calls went unanswered, his calendar emptied, his emails received curt replies. But his pride refused to let go. He sent messages late at night, accusing me of betrayal, claiming I had sabotaged him. At first I ignored them. Then, when they became increasingly erratic, borderline threatening, I archived every one of them. Evidence, I reminded myself. Every lie he told was another rope tightening around his neck. Meanwhile, my own position within the company shifted. Executives sought me out for insights. Board members asked me to lead technical briefings, and colleagues began approaching me not as a quiet coder, but as a leader. For months, Daniel had tried to erase my presence. Now, it was impossible to ignore. The final reckoning came during Devon Global's annual shareholder conference. It was the company's most important event of the year, streamed live to investors and analysts worldwide. The board wanted Aurora front and center, this time not as a flashy gimmick, but as the true engine of the company's future. They asked me to lead the presentation. I stood backstage that morning, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Months of silence, of patience, of watching Daniel steal and manipulate, it had all led to this. I adjusted the microphone, feeling the hum of the audience beyond the curtain. My hands were steady. My voice, when I finally spoke, was clear. "Good morning. My name is Claire Bennett, and I am the creator of Aurora." The words echoed across the hall, simple yet undeniable. For the next 40 minutes, I guided the audience through Aurora's journey, not with exaggeration, not with empty promises, but with truth. I showed them how it worked, what problems it solved, and why it mattered. I revealed data, results, and future plans, every detail backed by evidence. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Investors rose to their feet, journalists scribbled furiously, analysts nodded with approval. Aurora wasn't just a success, it was a revelation. And this time, no one could take that away from me. As I stepped off stage, I caught sight of Daniel in the shadows near the back of the room. His suit was rumpled, his eyes hollow. He looked at me, not with anger now, but with something closer to disbelief, as though he still couldn't accept that his empire had fallen and mine had risen from its ruins. He tried one last time. Later that evening, he cornered me in the lobby, his voice low, almost pleading. "We could have ruled this place together," he said. "You had the talent, I had the charisma. Why couldn't you just stay quiet and let me lead?" I looked at him, And for the first time, I almost felt pity. Almost. Because the truth doesn't belong in the shadows, I said. And neither do I.